Hello, my name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach with over 40 years of experience. I'm currently in private practice in London, in the UK. This video will be the third in a series under the title Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. In my first video, I offered a critique of woke psychotherapy as informed by critical social justice theory and aimed at the training of therapists in the practice of psychotherapy. In my second video, I began to offer an alternative, which I think is better. And this came out of my experience of teaching a course titled Diversity to students working toward master's degrees and qualification as psychotherapists in the UK. In that video, I really addressed that I feel that woke psychotherapy, despite critical social justice's emphasis on intersectionality and diversity, that it really stops short of the full picture. And I try to paint that in my second video. In this video, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to talk about human universals, what we share as human beings, universal human nature. I find that along with not addressing diversity adequately, critical social justice neglects human universals almost entirely. In fact, because it tends to divide human beings into two groups, oppressors and oppressed, and puts us in antagonistic power struggles with each other, the very idea of human universals raises their hackles because it's perceived as some kind of imposition by a dominant culture on others. It really wants to point to diversity and ignore commonalities. And I think that this is an incoherent and unnecessary point of view and not very useful. And I hope to make the case as we go along that there's no reason that recognizing diversity means that we have to neglect universals. Just as in my last video, I used the integral idea of four quadrants, four fundamental dimensions of human beings to explore the ways we're different. I'm going to use those same four dimensions in this video to explore the ways that we're the same. And to use common language, that boils down to body, mind, relationships, and environment. I invite you to watch my second video in which I explain this in further detail, which I won't do in this video. I'll put up a graphic later as I'm going through it. So if you want to know more about it, you could watch the second video, which I encourage you to watch in any case. Before I get on to filling out the picture of what's universal in these four categories of body, mind, relationships, and environment, I want to address a couple major arguments that it seems critical social justice has with the idea of human universals. The first is that of anomalies. What I'm going to share in a bit is what could be considered to be universal, or we could say almost universal, which means whether we're talking about individuals or cultures, while there may be a pervasive pattern of similarity, there can be outliers, there can be anomalies. And biologically, nature seems to love anomalies. It's what leads to evolution. So they need to be recognized and acknowledged that that's true. And that when I say something's universal, sometimes you come up with an exception. To me, this does not negate the idea that there are shared human experiences and dynamics that we could point to as almost always true. The other thing that I want to point out, the other argument that I see critical social justice making against the idea of human universals is to point to diversity. And I'd like to make the distinction between surface and deep structures. That what is different is mostly surface structures, and that underlying those are deep structures. For instance, just to take language and thought. So every culture, every person has some way to communicate. usually a verbal language. And we have different languages. You can't say everybody speaks the same language. But it has been shown, Noam Chomsky was the pioneer of this, that there are underlying structures for language that are cross-culturally seen. They're common. Underlying the different ways of making vocal sounds are these grammatical structures. So that's one example of a surface and a deep structure. Human thought. Clearly, individuals have different thoughts. They think about different things in different ways. But underlying that is basic cognitive functions, that we have perceptions of ourselves and the world, and we generate ways of making meaning out of it, making coherent understanding of what we're experiencing. Now, that meaning that we make, the understanding that we have may vary, but it's common to human beings to make cognitive sense of their world and their experience. I don't think that either of these arguments show that the notion of human universals is a fallacy. And I don't know for certain why critical social justice would make this argument, but I speculate on 2 points. One is their assertion via postmodernism that there is no objective reality, that it's all constructed. There's nothing underlying our constructions. The other is that we're divided into these groups of oppressors and oppressed, and that once you begin to identify something universal, then you're oppressing somebody. You're asserting that everybody must be like that, and you couldn't possibly have come up with it except by your own kind of culturally relativistic construction. And so therefore it can't be valid. To embrace the notion of human universals would deconstruct their construction, and it would give us a sense of common human cause. And if we were able to do that, they'd be out of business. All right, with no further ado, let's get to body. What's universal? Well, no, let me back up. Let me say these preliminary remarks first before I go into each category. Most fundamentally, this is another value of these 4 quadrants. I think the 4 quadrants point to something that truly is universal. There aren't any anomalies when it comes to the 4 quadrants. All people have a body of some sort. If you don't have a body, you're not here. All people have a mind. All people have an interior experience of some kind. Thoughts, feelings, sensations. There's a subjectivity for all people. There isn't a culture that doesn't have this, or an individual. We all have relationships. We're all born from a mother. And even if you're a hermit living in a cave, not relating to anybody you did once upon a time, that informed you, that allowed you to grow and develop. So all human beings have relationships of some kind at some point. And everybody who has a body that exists in a physical setting, in an environment of some kind. Regardless of where, there is a physical environment. So that much is true for all of us. Body, mind, relationships, and environment. But now to just focus on body. I have lists that I'll be reading, and as I said in my last video, my lists are not exhaustive. They're merely to illustrate the range of things that can be considered, in this case, as universally true. Human beings need oxygen, water, and food. We have a heart and a circulatory system. We have the ability to feel sensations like pain, pleasure, heat, and cold. There may be anomalies to this. Somebody who has extreme neuropathy or paralysis or something, but by and large, people feel sensations. We have a nervous system to transmit signals, sensations and other signals throughout the body, and a brain that processes things. We have the ability to heal wounds and recover from injuries and illnesses. We have a skeletal structure. Even if we're missing limbs, we still have a skeletal structure of some kind for the body that remains. We have the capacity to grow and age. We have the ability to reproduce. And again, not everybody has the ability to reproduce, but generally human beings do have the capacity to reproduce. And cultures have members who can and do reproduce so that the culture carries on and continues. We have the need for sleep and rest. We have the ability to adapt to different environments. And existentially, there's a big one, something that's true for all of us. We're all bound to die. That's everybody's ultimate fate, is for this body to be no more. That's our common ground. That's the so-called great equalizers of the peasant and the king, is death. Not to mention our vulnerability to illness and injury, along with our ability to recover from it. So those are some things about body that are universal. Mind. Consciousness. Awareness of our thoughts, feelings, and surrounding environment. We have the ability to learn and the ability to remember. Again, for some people, either with brain injuries or illnesses, memory may become an issue, but by and large, people remember things. We have emotions. These are universally human, to feel things. We solve problems, maybe in different ways and with different levels of skill, but we survive individually and as cultures by solving problems. We have imaginations. We can picture things that aren't present. We have perception, and we process the sensory input. We make meaning out of it. We have beliefs and values. All people seem to believe something and value something. Same with cultures. Some degree of self-awareness, at least self-consciousness, some idea of I exist, I'm a person. We make decisions, little and large, both individually and collectively as a culture. We decide things. We have intuition. To some degree, we have what I spoke of in the last video as theory of mind, which is we can think about our own interior world and the interior world of others. And this is also related to the category of relationships, but we'll put it in mind for now. We daydream. We feel motivations, different drives. We may have a drive for sex. We may have a drive to eat. We have a drive to accomplish things. We have a drive to protect things. We're motivated. We're curious. We have a sense of morality. We decide what's right and wrong. Even if what we decide is that what's good for me is what's good, we're still deciding what's good. That's our moral compass. And another thing that I think is universal for human beings in terms of our mind is that we experience uncertainty and confusion. Maybe not continuously, but at some point. I don't know of anybody, and I can't imagine anybody who never experienced uncertainty or confusion. Again, a limited list, but hopefully enough to begin to demonstrate the kinds of things that we share as human beings. Okay, let's move on to relationships. I want to start with the foundation. It's said that we're a social animal, we're a social species, and I believe that starts very early in our attachments and the kind of attachments we form with our caregivers, whether it's a mother, father, or somebody else. We have attachment needs. If they're not met, we don't develop, and we may not even survive. And those needs go on to be expressed in terms of familial bonds, in terms of development of friendships, in terms of love relationships, in terms of finding a partner to form a family with. That this is universal for human beings and across cultures. It may be that not everybody chooses to form a family. It may be that not everybody finds a partner. But there's a need for some kind of social connection. To facilitate that, we have communication and language. And language can be a verbal or a written language, but it doesn't have to be written, and it doesn't even have to be verbal. It could be sign language or gestural language. There are ways that we communicate our needs, our desires to each other so that we can negotiate our needs. That's universal. We need trust in our relationships. I think that's universal. We hesitate to interact with people that can't be trusted. We gravitate towards those who can be trusted. We have a capacity for cooperation. It's how we create culture. It's how we create civilization. It's how we create families or communities. Is that human beings have, part of being a social animal is that we have the capacity for cooperation. We also universally have the capacity for conflict, for there to be a conflict of needs, and to enter into antagonistic relationships with others. I don't think there's a person or a culture where that isn't a possibility, if not a reality. As a member of our culture, and that's the other thing about relationships. It's not just an individual sense of relationship. It's a culture in itself, which is a set of relationships. And every culture has its own values, its beliefs, its mores, its myths. And as a member of one's culture, that's part of our own belief system. There are cultures that don't have norms, mores, and ways to organize themselves through common belief. Again, all of those things may be diverse and different, but they're there. That's the deep structure. Human beings tend to organize themselves. We organize ourselves in terms of social hierarchy, in which there are those with more status and more power, and those with less status and less power. And we might say that might be a contention for social justice theory and activists, but it's universally true. And being able to deal with that fact, recognize that fact, and deal with it, I think is important. Most individuals, but all cultures, celebrate things, create ceremonies and rituals for life passages, whether it's births or marriages or deaths or a rite of passage from childhood, adolescence into adulthood. Every culture has their way of doing that. Again, on the surface, these are very different. They look different. There's different kinds of mythologies. There's different kinds of music, different kinds of food, different kinds of costumes, different kinds of dances. All kinds of things can be different, but underlying that is that all cultures celebrate life and different aspects of life. What's universally true, I think, also is that we all have some sense of social identity, of what group we belong to and what group we don't belong to. Whether it's our family, our clan, our tribe, our community, our local community, our state, our nation. Ultimately, I'm making the case for an identity that embraces humanity, but we all have some sense of social identity. It's the group we belong with. What comes with this is something else that's universal, and that is the notion of the in-group and the out-group. That we tend to favor our own group. We make affiliation and allegiance with our group, and those outside of our group we either ignore or we feel antagonistic and competitive toward. This is true. It's not just white Westerners who have this in-group, out-group mentality. It's true for all human groups. Well, of course, there's more within the category of relationship that I could name, but I'm going to move on to environment and read off my list here. Whether we're an individual or collectively as a culture, we have a need for a safe environment. We need to be protected from life-threatening dangers, universally. We also have a dependency on resources, including water, food, energy, and materials, building materials, whether we're making tools or we're making tools to make things with other materials like structures or anything else that we need. So our environment provides resources, and we need those resources in addition to needing safety. We generate waste, and we have to manage and dispose of that waste. Whether you're talking about your own house and your toilet and your rubbish bin and your recycling bin, or you're talking about your community, or you're talking about your nation, we produce waste and we have to deal with it. We have an interaction. We all have an interaction with our natural environment, with wildlife and flora and fauna, whether we're in a city or in the country or in the outback. We have a relationship to the natural world, one way or the other. Even in a city, we may seek out the park. Wherever we are, whoever we are, we have to make adaptations to our climate. We have to find out what grows. We have to find out how to survive winters. We have to figure out how to survive hot, dry summers. That we have to adapt to whatever the climate is where we live. We're all vulnerable wherever we live to natural disasters, whether from storms like hurricanes and tornadoes and typhoons, whether from earthquakes, whether from floods. There are natural disasters within our environment that we're all vulnerable to, potentially, at some point. We have cross-culturally, but in different ways, an awareness of seasonal changes. I know, having moved to London from Massachusetts, my seasonal awareness has changed. Winter is not as severe, but I still am aware of it, and along with awareness of seasonal changes is preparation for an adaptation to those seasonal changes. And finally, something else that appears to be universal, maybe there are individual anomalies, but most people and within all cultures, there's a sense of awe and wonder, if not reverence, for nature, natural beauty. That's shared. In my last video, I made a case for the importance of recognizing the true range of diversity for the practice of psychotherapy. So why is it important for psychotherapy that we recognize human universals? Why is that important? Well, as I've already said, if all we can focus on is how we're different, and we don't recognize what's universally true and shared between us, then we will divide ourselves into in-groups and out-groups. We will compete and not recognize each other's shared humanity. We will come to behave in exactly the way that critical social justice critiques. We will marginalize each other, and it'll lead to conflict, and that will escalate. There's no end to it. If we can't recognize our shared humanity, then we're at odds with each other. And the end point of that, really, and you may think I'm exaggerating, but I think this is true, we wind up in genocidal wars. So that's a reason beyond psychotherapy why I think that this is important. In terms of psychotherapy itself, my purpose in this video isn't, and it isn't now, to provide specific clinical skills that one would employ based on a recognition of human universals. But I'll say this, that in terms of assessment, both an initial assessment and ongoing assessment, it ought to be included, a recognition of our client's humanity in its full range ought to be part of what we are looking at. And when we do that, we bring that to a collaborative, a joint effort at treatment planning, so that along with the client, we're considering these things. And so how does that work? I think most therapists would agree that a fundamental and important aspect of what psychotherapy ought to do is facilitate self-awareness and self-understanding. And that ought to include the ways that we're human, what we share with other people. That ought to be a part of our understanding of ourselves. Beyond that, we could stop pretending that we can't possibly know somebody. We can't possibly know our clients if we don't belong to the same identity group as they do. We'll be encouraged to look at our own human experience, to look at the ways that we've struggled in our own lives, to find commonality so that we can know something. We are always limited. We can't know each other absolutely. But this notion that we can't possibly understand somebody if we're not part of their group is a fallacy. I won't accept it. I think we have a greater possibility for understanding each other than critical social justice would lead us to believe. So as therapists, I would say we won't retreat into a bubble of pretend ignorance, but neither will we retreat into a bubble of shame. If we find ourselves identified or identifying ourselves as a member of a privileged group and we feel shame about that, we can cut ourselves off from being present with the person in front of us. Maybe we do feel shame, but we don't have to insulate ourselves with that. We don't have to pretend somehow that we've been able to float above all the pain and suffering of humanity for our lives, and we don't know anything about it. Somehow we're different because we're part of a privileged group. No, we can take ourselves down a notch or two or several and acknowledge that we're part of the stew. We're in it together. We're with other people. We may not have exactly their form of pain and suffering, but we know it. We know our own, and there's an overlap. There's a resonance. We can generate a feeling of empathy and compassion because of what we share with others. And while not reducing ourselves to a state of ignorance and shame, we can also refrain from reducing our clients to their identity as a victim. We can recognize and encourage them to recognize their own internal sense of esteem and agency, and support and encourage the taking of action to cultivate a life that's desired, and not withdrawing from the world out of the idea that one is simply or mostly or primarily a victim. We shouldn't ignore, neglect, or minimize the ways that the people we work with may have been mistreated or experienced injustice in their lives, and support them to address that in any way they want and need to. But what we could do is not suggest that that's their primary identity, that that's really where they belong and that's who they are. They're a member of the human family, no less than anybody else, no less than the therapist. And they can be encouraged to feel that and claim that and act on that. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I really appreciate it. If you've liked this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, leave me a comment. I'd really like to hear from you. Let me know what you think of what I've said, and if there is something that you'd like me to address in a future video, let me know, and I'll try to cover it if I can. Also, share this video with a friend or with somebody that you think might find it interesting and useful. In the meantime, take care, be well, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.